Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Today I'm sharing 4 new reports with you that are exclusive to BBR Investigations. And for all they're different to each other, I'm sure you will see the connections between them and how the information within them also matches many of the experiences already reported here in the UK. The first case is a new report, and it comes from the well-known cryptid hotspot of Thetford Forest. The wild humanoid figure seen in this case was described as a monster by the witness. A following investigation of this case left the 2 men involved confused by an experience with an unseen thing. Then I'll feature a report from Dunskey Castle, where a dog picks up on the negative activity from something unseen, which is pretty prevalent in many of the cases I've worked. Our investigation into the unseen then takes us to Fleetwood on the northwest coast of England, where a man out walking is shadowed by something he cannot see. And then finally, we have a case of a strange winged creature that would screech as it would come ever closer to the home. I will also include some validating reports from the area and things that match up. I'm sure you'll enjoy tonight's podcast, so get comfortable and I'll begin. The case I'm sharing with you now centres around a well-known cryptid hotspot here in the UK, and that is Thetford Forest. A humanoid figure that was almost 10 feet tall has been seen in the forest that happened in 2020. The account comes from Richard Thompson, who says, "Hi Debbie, as requested, this is my friend Mark's encounter that took place the 22nd of October 2020, around 8 o'clock in the evening. I've enclosed a picture of the exact location of the sighting. My friend Mark and his fiancée Kerry were staying at Linford Hall on the night in question, and as they were arriving at the hotel, they were travelling by car along Linford Road. His fiancée Kerry was driving when she noticed a hulking black figure in the tree line, which is within a couple of metres of the road. The figure was standing stationary, and then Mark also noticed it. They estimate it to have been between 8 to 10 feet tall and about 4 to 5 feet wide across the chest, and it was all black in colour. The couple both felt an instant sensation of fear on seeing the figure, which they noticed was humanoid in shape. They proceeded to the hotel and left their belongings and then headed back down Linford to go and get some food from a restaurant about 20 minutes after their initial sighting. To their surprise, they heard a deer was standing in the road close to the location of the sighting. The deer didn't move, which is so unusual. Both Mark and Kerry got out and approached the deer, which just stood there. They weren't fazed by them at all. My friend Mark told me this story after we met up, having not seen each other for a couple of years. It was unprompted, as I was telling him about my interest in Sasquatch, and he put 2 and 2 together and kind of realised what he'd witnessed with his fiancée Kerry. And he said he'd never mentioned this to anyone. Richard said, "I met with Kerry, and the first word she came out with to describe the being she saw was a monster." So I did some research, and lo and behold, there had been sightings in the area along the A1065. So myself and Mark decided to go and have a look yesterday, 21st of July 2024, as it was a full moon. We visited the site where Mark and Kerry had their sighting about 10 o'clock at night, and then decided we'd find a spot along the A1065 and park up and just listen. The second image I uploaded is the location where we were at. We walked up the logging road past the barrier about 100 yards or so, and there was a large pile of cut tree trunks piled up about 6 feet or so, and we decided to sit on top of them. We just stayed silent and just listened. This was around midnight, roughly. It was dead silent, very dark, as we were surrounded by trees on either side of us. The log pile was about 20 feet from the tree line. We sat there about 30 minutes or so passed, and then we started to hear movement in the tree line. Not heavy, but possibly something in the human weight range, which was off to the right of us, to our side and behind us. It was literally 20 feet or so from us at that point. Then within seconds, the ground movement stopped and it started again. But this time it was 25 feet up in a tree behind us. You could hear whatever it was breaking 2 or 3 limbs in the process. We shone the torch in the direction, saw nothing. It was very unnerving to the point that I said, let's go, let's get out of here. Me and Matt cannot logically explain what it was, and it made no sense at all. No animal could move that fast and move up a tree to boot. It did it silently too. In the transition from ground level to up the tree, it seemed just silent. So I've no idea what it could have been. But to be honest, I was really wary of dogmen, so we got out of there. We then moved further up the road onto the other side and saw what I'd describe as a possible UFO. Yours truly, Richard Thompson. Well, I contacted BBR investigator Kevin Scariot, who lives in the area along that road and has a great deal of local knowledge. I sent across the details of Richard's experience, and Kevin got back to me quickly with some useful information. He said, I know Linford Hall well, Deb. It's quite remote, and it abuts the military training ground area. It's also where they filmed the series Hello Hello. Another strange thing has occurred that I felt I should mention. Now, I may be being paranoid, but having lived here for 39 years, the Forestry Commission have never been anywhere near my home because they weren't interested in the old trees there. But since I had reported that sighting, they've now turned up and marked a large number of trees, which is to be felled, which is pretty amazing as the rest of the area resembles a jungle. Now, as they've stopped cutting it back, it's become so overgrown. I want to thank Richard for sending that report in to me, and it immediately made me think of something very similar. But in this case, it didn't happen in Thetford. It happened close to Cannock Chase in an area called Dalreddy Cottage, where a number of deer were frozen solid in the middle of the road, staring off into the woodland. On a recent visit to Birmingham, I realised just how many roadworks and diversions there were on the M6. Coming back at night, it was a similar time. It was about 1:15 in the morning when that report took place. So as I passed Dalreddy Cottage, that was paramount in my mind. The gentleman who made the report actually drives for a living, and he drives very regular on the M6, and he too was a victim to the diversions. And as he's driving along and he gets to the roundabout near Dalreddy Cottage, he sees 4 deer, and they are stood in the middle of the road, regardless of traffic, and they are staring off into the woodland on one side. He said they were completely transfixed, and nothing any of the drivers could do would move them out of the way. So they had to go the wrong way around the roundabout to actually pass the deer. As he was passing, he's in an Arctic, so he's about 10 feet up. He's got a better view than all of the other drivers out there. And he saw what he describes as 2 red eyes. He thought at first that they might have been 2 red lights, about 8 to 12 inches apart. He said, I had a good eye level from where I was sitting in the lorry. As I passed the deer, they seemed to break their trance and they scattered into nearby woodland. I've seen wild animals close to the road before, but I don't know what those red globes were. It could have been eye shine, I suppose. Whatever it was, it spooked the deer out of the woods onto a major road filled with traffic. It was dark, and there could have been a serious accident. I think I broke the stare between the deer and the eyes as I drove through. All of my hairs on my arm stood on end at that moment. I can still remember that feeling, even weeks later. I went back, looking for red lights or reflectors the very next day. I tried to debunk the whole incident. Something must have been there, and I was confusing it with possible eye shine. That's what I told myself. I was going to measure with a tape measure how high the red orbs were, but I felt that feeling of complete dread, and I thought better of it. It was a sickly feeling, as if I wasn't welcome there. As I drive for a living, I have a dash cam fitted in the cab. I check the dash cam and it cuts out just before the roundabout, and it didn't come back on until much later. It's never malfunctioned before. I went back on the 18th of Feb and it felt different. I didn't get a bad feeling this time. There was still nothing visible in front of the tree. There was nothing that could account for those red eyes that were completely out there in the black. He said, I should have been able to see a trunk there or something in front of that tree, but there wasn't anything to mistake for those red orbs. That report and the report that we've just heard from Thetford are very, very similar. And there are other reports that are similar. He mentioned something climbing up a tree that they couldn't see. Richard stated that you could hear it, but you couldn't see it. Andy decodes, as many of you know. He used to drive for a living, and when he was driving one day, he saw what he described as either several invisible beings move up a tree or one very large one. He couldn't tell. It was a movement like the Predator that you see in the film. Lots of people talk about it. There's a case in the northeast, a chap who does sled riding with his huskies, and one of his dogs, Mika, was attacked by something when they were out training, and that something ran up a tree, and you couldn't see it. You could see the energy moving, and you could hear the branches breaking around it, and you could feel that it was there, but you couldn't keep your eye on it. Some people call these beings invisible life forms. I've heard them called shimmer beings, glimmer man, all manner of name for them. But the best one I've ever heard came from the northeast, and it was actually from the wife of the husband who took the account of Mika when she was attacked. And she said she saw sitting in a tree on one of the boughs a prismatic being that was seemed to be reflecting its surroundings back at us. And I think that's a very good description of what these people are trying to explain to us when they are hearing it. It's not like a bluff charge where it's an animal, but you just don't quite see it. It's actually something moving through that woodland that's moving the trees, making as much noise as it wants, that cannot be physically seen. And I think that's absolutely terrifying. I often receive reports from people who see dogs that act incredibly strangely in certain areas, showing fear or terror. And I often wonder if the dog is picking up on the energy of the land there or the building itself. The case I'm covering now kind of goes into that. A chap called Gavin got in touch with me recently, and he said, I watched the video you made, Deb. A British survival expert has a strange experience. And I quickly noticed a lot of people were talking about their own supernatural events in the comments. So I thought I'd share one of mine with you. It's nowhere near as dramatic as some of the others, however, it's worth mentioning, perhaps due to the dog's behaviour. Basically, I witnessed with my own eyes a dog that usually loves walks and exercise and exploring the woods suddenly freak out, and it wants to get out of the old ruin at Dunsky Castle. I had a head torch on at the time, and I had multiple other people with me. Another of those people also had the same bad feeling as me come over them, and as soon as we started exploring the castle, that's when we felt it. The dog reacted in a way I hadn't seen before, and it was wanting out of the place as quickly as possible. It was clearly unsettled. I didn't hear or see anything odd, but I've never since had such a strong feeling of this place is bad and that I shouldn't be here. It was a strong sense that something evil had happened. Sure enough, when I was back at home, I researched the place, and I found that there were several murders and tragedies historically linked, as well as sightings and reports of spectres and voices where no one was around. If you look up the history of the castle, you immediately discover it's supposedly one of the most haunted places in Scotland. This is coming from someone who previously was very doubtful of such things, but I've no doubt now that there is, at the very least, other dimensions, or planes of some sort that exist alongside ours, out of space and time. I feel absolutely positive that if I went back or spent enough time there, eventually I'd have a much more dramatic experience with one of these spirits and entities, and that it wouldn't be one I'd remember fondly. As I said above, I'd normally scoff at this kind of thing, but in the last few years I've been considerably more open-minded. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this or similar experiences you've perhaps had. I replied to Gavin and I've let him know that there are a number of reports where dogs seem to cotton on to strange behaviour that's happening around them. Dogs don't dismiss natural intuition. Humans do that. So even that feeling of fear when it comes, we kind of excuse it away. It's just a silly feeling, It's just me being dramatic. It's the power of suggestion. It's your intuition picking up on things that are going on around you. And I think us humans can also pick up on the land and the kind of emotion that gets stored within it. The land all across the world is an electrical battery, has a mesh that covers it everywhere. And it's filled with ley lines and areas of high energy and low energy. I noticed that this castle was built on abbey grounds, which tells me they were very important grounds back in the day. I took Gavin's advice and I went in search of some information on Dunsky Castle, and I wasn't disappointed. Dunsky is a ruinous and atmospheric old castle, kind of sits right on the edge of the cliffs above the sea near Port Patrick, which is in Galloway, in the far west south of Scotland. Now, there was once an older castle at the same spot as the ruins we see now, but that burnt down as an act of vengeance several hundred years ago. One grim event concerns the abbot of Solsea Abbey, who was imprisoned and tortured in the castle in order for him to sign over the abbey land. Dunsky is said to have a brownie or a hairy man, which is a kind of small, mischievous fae or kind of a hobgoblin that kind of lives in houses and barns. In Scottish folklore, brownies are always male, and are short and hairy and a wee bit shabby. It's also reputed to be haunted by the ghost of a nursemaid who dropped an infant child from one of the windows onto the beach far below. As we know, written text becomes rarer the further back in time you go, but I was able to find events of war and bloodshed starting as early as 690 AD. And in 1291, King Edward I of England grants the keys of Wigton Castle to Walter de Currie. Walter's son later becomes an outlaw, and he uses the fort of Dunsky as the hideout for his band of robbers. Being a cruel man in nature, he would punish members of the local population by hanging them by their thumbs from the castle walls. Eventually, his crimes reached the ear of the king, and he put out a reward, and Robert Fitzgerald hunted Currie down. He found him in Colfin Glen, near Lochans, and he drove his sword into Currie up to the hilt, and his head is taken to the king, and Fitzgerald received his reward. It was also the home to Walter de Currie, a murderous pirate who lived there in the 1400s. He would plunder ships and seize gold and silk, but as legend has it, he also snatched an Irish minstrel. But the minstrel was not content to be an easy source of entertainment to Currie. He could, if he wanted to, tell tall tales and sing songs and ballads to Currie and his men as they drank their fill. But he couldn't resist poking his new murderous master. Bit of fun, bit of Mickey. He made Currie himself the butt of his jokes and humiliated him in front of his own men. So Currie threw the minstrel into the dungeons below the castle and left him there to starve. It's said that the minstrel groped his way along the stone subterranean dungeon until he found a secret tunnel. He followed it until he reached a cave on the shore of the open sea below the castle. He could hear the roaring waves and he could see the moon glistening above. But he could not scale the slick, steep walls. He died a slow death looking for freedom. And it is said that above the waves on a stormy night you can hear as he plays his music from the passage where he died. I would imagine the dog was picking up on all of that, and that's just what we have a record of. The land and stone hold energy, and sometimes it can replay, like an old CD or a tape. But other times, when there's been bloodshed or high emotion, that feeling is like a smudge on the land and remains, and some people can pick up on that. I would imagine There are many people out there who've had a strange experience around Dunsker and have just never reported it. In fact, I'm certain of it. There will be people who've gone out there as family groups for a visit, holiday makers, people who've worked around the castle, and they will have become connected to that land as well as we have. And as Gavin put it, sometimes it's like two worlds kind of collide at that moment. There's a report that came in through Charmaine Fraser from a nurse who was with her husband and her brother, and they went for a holiday in Dalbeattie. And she said it was as soon as they walked into the forest, it just felt awful. She said it didn't take long for something to feel off about those woods. It was quite soon after entering that I started to become unnerved and paranoid, and I felt a sense of danger. It was like one of those horror films where people get picked off by wild animals living in the woods. I was imagining us all being taken out by one, and I kept thinking there could be people in here following us, waiting to get us, and we'd never know. My brother and my husband kept wandering off away from me, and I was really scared. For some reason, I just didn't understand why I felt like this. I actually started to plan how to fight if someone would come and attack us. She couldn't put an exact date, but she said it happened in the late 2000s. She lives in the Forth Valley, so she's used to being out and about. She's always walking. She said she also went on a trip to Aberfeldy with her husband, and she said, we saw the woodland walks there, but there was no way I was going in. I kept thinking about what happened at Dalbeattie, and I felt the same way here as I did there. She says her previous experience has ruined walking in the woods for her. There's a report in Aberdare that came in through Beastwatch, and it was passed over to me from the chap there named Liam Dorrickett, and that was on the 17th of August 2016. And he said, bit of a strange one this morning whilst out training the pup. We went to a new place today, high up on the mountain. Thick conifer plantation, wide open heathland, lots of white grass and reeds and sedges. Anyway, I parked up on me walking. I thought I'd train her on a few simple retrieves. And it was fine. Training session was going well. Then it all went funny. My dog's name was Teal, and I sent her out for a marked retrieve. She picked it no problem at all. But on her way back to me, she just stopped dead in her tracks. And she started staring and growling into the woods just behind me. Now, anyone who knows her knows that this is not what she's like. All she wants to do is get that dummy in her hand. For her to stop and spit that dummy down, I knew something wasn't right. After a little while and some encouragement, I got her to come to me. So we moved to another area to do a bit more. But she was having none of it. She just seemed so unsettled. So I decided to call it for a day. On the way back to the car through the forestry track, I decided to just give her another simple dummy on the inside of the wood, just to try and end on a good note. But she wasn't interested at all. She would go out and stop just short of the tree line and stand there pacing, looking into the woods, but then she'd go no further. So I ended up just picking it up myself. It was a funny old morning. I actually spoke to a lady she was a dog walker actually, and she was in a similar area, and it was the first time I released this report, and she said her dog had acted strange. I know there was dogs that acted strange in Afton Forest as well. It happens all across the UK. Animals are incredibly good at listening to their instincts, as I said earlier. Some of us humans are still trying to learn that. Fleetwood in Lancashire is one of my favourite places. There used to be a shop there, and I don't know if it's still there, and it was on the seafront, and you could go in, buy some kippers, and they put them in a box and post them to your address for when you came home off holiday. My dad absolutely loved him, and he would think nothing of just driving us up there on a summer evening, and we'd get fish and chips and just sit and play on the sand. A lot of fun memories for me. I was contacted by a gentleman from the area who said, I listen to your podcast with interest. While I'm not a believer in ghosts or aliens or UFOs or anything like that, I'm always intrigued by things that are unexplainable. My resolute disbelief in all things spooky has been challenged a couple of times in my 50 plus years experience. Below is something that happened to me that, whilst I have no explanation for the event, I'm curious if anyone else has had similar encounters or has any possible explanation for what happened that night. As a casual astronomer, I try to head out on a clear night to see any interesting skyward activity. A couple of years ago, on a clear October or November night during the peak of the Leonid or Orionid meteor shower, I woke up about 2 a.m., decided to go to the nearby Fleetwood Nature Reserve to see if anything interesting was happening in the sky. The nature reserve is relatively dark, but mostly it's very nearby and quite convenient. Fleetwood Nature Reserve leads to the River Wyre, and it sits between the docks and Fleetwood Tip. I know, a great place to be close to nature. And it's built on the site of the old Fleetwood power station. I guess there's quite a bit of history for that site. By the time I'm dressed and I've driven to the reserve, it's about 3 a.m, and I'm parked on Winwood Avenue. I exit my vehicle to go through a gate entering the nature reserve at the northern end, and I walk down the gravel path about 200, 300 metres to the riverside. And there are benches at the riverside that make for a comfortable place to sit and look up. The gravel path has hedges and bushes either side of it, the whole thing being about 12 foot wide. And as I start walking on that path, I become aware of the sound of footsteps behind me on the gravel. They sound the same pace as my footsteps, but about 30 feet behind me. Whilst a little unnerved, I'm a big fella, so I'm not afraid. And whilst I'm wondering what someone would be doing out there on the dark reserve at this time in the morning, I'm also conscious of the fact that I'm there, so maybe it's not that unusual. I continue walking towards the river, and the footsteps stay around 30 feet behind me all the way, at the same pace, for the whole 200 metres or so to the riverside. I'm a little concerned by this, but determined not to let it interfere with observing the sky. My night vision is good at this point, and I've looked behind me several times, and while I would have been able to see someone on the path behind me, I see nothing. I sit on the bench and light a cigarette and look up for anything interesting. All the time I'm sat there, the footsteps are pacing on the gravel and remain the same sort of distance away from me. They do not get any closer or further away, just pacing footsteps on the gravel. After about 10 or 15 minutes and starting to get concerned and distracted by the footsteps that continue all the time I'm sat on the bench, I decide to give up looking for any meteors and get out of there. As a good Boy Scout as I was, I'm usually carrying a torch, and while still on the bench, I take this from my pocket in readiness to see what the hell it is pacing on the gravel path behind me. And as I stand up, I turn, shine the torch at where the sound is coming from, and I head directly back down the path. The footsteps stop immediately. I shine the torch down the path into the bushes alongside it, but the footsteps have just stopped. Nothing's on the path. Nobody would have had time to get off that path, and even if they had, there was no sound, no change in the footstep speed or loudness. They just stopped. No rustle of bushes. Nothing. I head back to the car at a pace and hoping I'm alone. I regularly walk my dogs on the reserve during the day. Occasionally, I've taken them in the evening during the darker months of the year, and I've visited the site during the dark hours to view the sky. I've never heard the footsteps again, but with the dogs in the dark, they'll suddenly stop and stare back down the gravel tracks, with one dog growling and letting out a cautious bark. I tell them to behave and keep walking. I'm not keen for meeting something I can't explain. As I've said, I'm not readily a believer in beyond normal events. I'm an objective and logical guy, but an explanation for this event evades me. I'm curious if anyone can offer an explanation or has had a similar experience on the nature reserve. As a child, this area was mostly overgrown concrete with the old power station building, huge cooling towers. It was a dangerous but exciting place to play. I'm not a historian, but I understood it. The first railway line into Fleetwood was built along the edge of this land, but I think the land became unstable and the line was redirected further inland. Many years ago, the cooling towers and the power station were demolished and the land was just left untouched. The nature reserve is a relatively recent development, happened in the last 20 years or so. There's very little activity on the reserve at night. I've used this route in the past when out bike riding. I'm a night owl and I pedal from Fleetwood to Blackpool and back about 3 a.m. I've never met anyone at those hours in the area. I have met many baffling but unexplainable characters nearer to Blackpool and the prom at that time, though. As I've said, I'm super logical. I'm an evidence based kind of guy, and this experience doesn't sit well in my worldview. I saw nothing where I definitely should have if there had been a physical person there. The same regular pacing for 10 to 15 minutes while I sat on the bench, and then suddenly, quickly, shining a torch around the area, only to find nothing. It's kind of troubling. In my 50 years, I have had plenty of bumps, noises, and knocks in the night that, while the source was not known, I've never jumped to an unearthly explanation. But the nature reserve footsteps experience has left me with enough evidence to know that I genuinely am left with beyond natural as an explanation. I have only had one other experience where the evidence of events left me pondering about how much we know of the real world around us. Thanks for taking the time again, Deb. I would appreciate it greatly if you could keep me in mind if you come across similar experiences to mine during your paranautical explanation of the not so natural. And great podcast and shows, and thanks for putting it out there for me and others to experience. Please do keep up the good work. Well, I intend doing this till I'm 104, is what I tell everybody. But coastal areas do seem to have a number of kind of creepy, on the edge of cryptid kind reports. This reminds me very much of a case that happened in the Lee Valley down in Oxfordshire, which is inland. A chap called Nick Hayes was going to meet his friends one evening and he was walking through an area of two embankments, and he said whatever was on that embankment was keeping pace with him, and when he stopped it would stop, and when he started it would start, and he realised that it was heading in the same direction as him, which was a bottleneck when you got to the golf course. And he said, I was absolutely terrified that I would actually run into it. And at that point, it kind of growled at him from the darkness. That must have been absolutely terrifying. But they happen everywhere. I've taken them from the mountains, I've taken them from the coast, and I've taken them inland. And some of them, for me, are far scarier than actually seeing something. Because seeing something, you can see it, you know what you're up against. But not being able to see it when you should, when it's right there or just behind you, I think that's far more unnerving. Far, far more unnerving. And there's a case in my files from Henley that centres around what was known as the Henley tree snapper. And it was shared with me by a chap who was a tree surgeon, and he would often meet with another guy and they would go down and stay in an area and they would cut the trees and then they'd go back home. So they had a caravan where they would stay because it was cheaper than staying in hotels or digs or anything like that. And he said there was one occasion when the other chap was down there without me. He said, but I know the location well. I stayed there many times myself. It's on the edge of a village called Stoke Row, not too far from Henley-on-Thames. I didn't mind staying there. It was on a small lane, had a field behind it, and it backed onto a woodland, a beach, and it was behind the pub known as the Crooked Billet. My mate said that one day he'd gotten back from the work site and he's lying down in his caravan after a hard day climbing up and down trees. So this would be around 5 or 6 o'clock. He began to hear the loud noise of branches snapping, and at first he just thought it was kids playing, and he ignored it. But the noises began to get louder, so much so that he eventually decided to go on and investigate and see what was going on. As he approached the woods, he could hear what sounded like large limbs being snapped in the canopy up above him. Even more curious now, not being able to see the source of the sounds, he headed straight into the woods to find out what was going on. At this point, the sound of breaking branches seemed to move off through the trees, away from him, and he was never able to see what was up there. He said it was as if something he couldn't see was moving through the canopy with ease, and it was moving away from him whilst all the time remaining unseen. He also claimed to find large, freshly snapped off branches as thick as his arm on the ground. His conclusion was that it had to be something the size of an orangutan. He said it went through the top of the trees moving fast, but I couldn't see it. I could hear it smashing its way through there, and I could see the movement of the limbs being smashed, but I couldn't see it at all. There's a similar case in the Box Hill area, Dorking Deep Dean, where two brothers were waiting to go down into the tunnels, the old World War II tunnels there, and they were just waiting for it to go dark, so there was no one around because they were obviously urban explorers and they wanted to sneak in there. He said as they were sitting, they realised that a lot of dogs were making an enormous amount of a racket, and they heard this roar. And at the sound of the roar, all of the dog went silent. And he said, the next second, all these branches started to snap, like something was coming through them rapidly, and it was coming through the trees towards us. It was moving the trees, breaking and snapping the branches like they were twigs. And then it stopped suddenly and went silent. After a couple of minutes, my brother said, what was that? And I just said, I don't know. And we just stayed there for around 10 minutes in silence, not saying a word to each other. We were just listening for any kind of sound. I was scared of moving, so we just stayed there in silence waiting. And we heard no more noise, thankfully. And it did sound like something was walking about in the dead leaves out there, but that could have been anything, so I'm not sure. A couple of years later, after I heard that, a lady got in touch with me from the area, and this was an unseen stomping thing, 2018. She was going to meet somebody for lunch, and she said, as I'm walking through the area, she heard what she described as something really big, thumping and banging and moving around in the woodland there, but she couldn't see it. Yeah, she said, I stopped dead in my tracks on hearing it. There's something in there, which at first sounded like a person foraging around in the undergrowth. They were brushing up against the trees there, and that was until I heard what followed. The sound of unbelievable heavy footsteps on the ground close by, but the maker of those footsteps was completely out of view. They were no ordinary footsteps, but they came from 2 feet, well spaced apart, that literally pounded the ground. It was so loud, I ran across the road feeling terrified, thinking what on earth could make a noise like that. There's another case in Paul in Hull, where there's 4 men in a car, and it's snowing, and they experience those thumping, thudding footsteps, and you can see the footprints in the snow, but you can't see what's making them. If you're outside and you suddenly have an event that we would class as not normal, like shadowing feet on the gravel behind you, something throwing things at you from a dark woodland, or you hear a series of clicks, you know something's out there, but you can't get your eyes on it. That's absolutely terrifying. But what if you hear it at your home? I've taken reports like this before, not only of screeching creatures, but some that are described as somewhere between an owl and a humanoid. I've taken reports where they've chased people out of an area. And in some cases, one was absolutely terrifying, where it landed on the top of an army shelter. How would you feel if you heard it in the woodlands at the back of your house? Or it made your cattle run across the fields? And how would you feel if it came directly to your door? Because that's what's happened to the witness in this case. And they contacted me about an experience they had in the year 2000s, early 2000s. And they said, when I was younger, I lived in Hayley. In the early 2000s, my dad and I were baffled by a nighttime cry we would hear that sounded like it was coming from the fields behind the house. The only way to describe it would be like the noise used as the sound effect of a pterodactyl in the movies. This unexplainable screeching lasted for years on and off, before one summer it started to come right up to the house, which was situated at the end of a large area of unlit farmland. The cry would begin in the distance and it grew louder as it came ever closer. The screeching cry lasted for around 5 seconds or so, and it grew higher in pitch at the end. Over and over and over again, it made this massive, loud cry with a gap of about 5 seconds in between each call. At first, I could hear it out near the sheep in the distance, and they would all bolt across the field. And then it came closer, and as it flew above the cattle, they would do the same, and they'd stampede across the grass with a loud rumble. And then the horses would bolt across their field as it came closer to us still. Finally, it reached our house. Beyond us, the old graveyard was home to hundreds of rooks, and even late at night, in the pitch dark, they would all take off and make a huge noise, as if something was around they were scared of. After months of this, I at last managed to see the source of the terror. I waited for about an hour in the garden, as previously, every time I tried to see it, my eyes were affected, as I was coming from a lit up room with the TV on, then out into pitch darkness, and I was unable to make out anything outside the lights. So I waited outside, so my eyes would adjust to the dark, and I listened to the cattle as they stamped and stamped as it came closer. And at last it came over the tree line of our garden, and I saw the most enormous owl ever. It was strange. Its wingspan was clearly wider than my arms and way over 6 feet. The body was like a huge fat cat or a well-fed toddler, and its head was huge, and its eyes were so big they looked like a cartoon. It would be about a metre tall, and I couldn't see the colours of its plumage. I saw it regularly then, while I was living there after that, and I heard it on and off for years, even when I visited home. I have no idea what it was. I looked and listened to all the other giant owls, and none looked like it. None made the noise that it did. There is nothing like it. I've searched all the scary sounding birds of the world online, and they are nothing compared to this creature. I heard a lady on a radio show from the US who once reported the same noise, but that's the only time I've heard anything similar. The most incredible sound that terrified the horses, the rooks, and the livestock, and it was a bit nervy to look up to it. I would imagine it was. There are lots of reports like this, as I said earlier, lots and lots of reports of strange, shrieking creatures that they just cannot identify. I was contacted by a chap called Chad Howell, and this happened to him in the Taliban area. And he said, "Hi, Mrs. Hatswell. My name's Chad Howell. I'm 46. And I listen to your podcast religiously, alongside probably every paranormal and cryptid show available. I had an encounter when I was very young in the Forest of Dean." He said, "I recently went for a break to the Brecon Beacons with my partner, who's from Merthyr, Wales. And roughly around 8:30 p.m, we left a local pub in Taliban where we both had a steak meal and we had a beer. So we had the lane lit up with our phones, so they both got iPhone 13s. And I heard something. And up ahead of us, all of a sudden, this thing, a flying creature, came out of the darkness about 5 feet from my head. No, stop, do it again. I was contacted by a chap called Chad Howell, and he was in the Brecon Beacons area with his partner, and they went for a meal in the pub. And when they left, it was about 8:30 p.m. He said it was dark. We had to use our phones to light up the path. I was ahead of my partner, and all of a sudden, this thing, this flying creature came out of the darkness about 5 feet from my head. It looked at me and flew off. This thing had a huge wingspan, and a tail. And it was moving like water in the air. It was weird as hell. I haven't stopped thinking about it. And it only just happened a month ago. He described its body as it had a blue, long body, had a round head with ears on the top. Its wings were pink, and he saw red veins. And the tail was like the tail of a kite in the wind. He said, all I can think of, it was like this creature in the movie Abyss, but in the air. But it looked and moved like it was underwater. I knew I saw it. My missus is a director. She makes short films for Film 4. She's a skeptic. But I've definitely got her into cryptid, and she now listens to you. And Monsters Among Us, real event type shows. He said it was not a bat, it wasn't a bird, and it wasn't an owl. He said, whatever we've seen it, I don't know what it was. I don't know what that thing was. It came out of the dark, and it was huge. And it just stood in front of me. I'd say like 5'11", 6.5 stone. Please could you let me know if anyone else has reported anything around there. I don't have any reports of anything around there precisely, but there are a number of winged creature reports across you, winged humanoids as some people call them. We live in a magical place, and there is a shift coming. And with that shift, it makes activity of all kinds amp up. Maybe that's why the reports are coming in faster and faster. I hope you've enjoyed tonight, and I will be back at the same time, same day next week for regular listeners and all of our new listeners. Thank you for joining me. If you could give this channel a like, make a comment or share, it really helps us to improve the channel. It's a way that you can support me. And as I say, I'll be back next week. Good night, everyone.